I will greentext a story my grandpa told me. Be Ranger, be 1965, be operating in Vietnam, raid Cambodia/Laos, ordered to go to a specific spot and eliminate enemy forces there, come across a small camp of NVA, 4 men. He was very specific about that for some reason. Waste them. Look around. Ammo caches, AKs, normal shit to find. Look in the tent. Dead Russians that were killed in the short firefight. All kinds of weird tech in the tent. Experimental night vision and shit. Almost on cue, a blacked out helicopter lands nearby. Paramilitary guys grab up all the strange high-tech equipment and the dead Russian. Tell them to burn everything, even the bodies. Flies away. I believe him. He's an honest man. I knew an old man named Foster who lived in Colorado by himself with his dogs and cats. He smoked a pack a day. Growing up, I always heard that he fought in Vietnam, but he didn't talk about it much. During my senior year of college, I took a class called Vietnam War Era History, which was taught by an ex-Army veteran who was under the auspices of Operation Phoenix. He asked us to either read a book about Vietnam or find a Vietnam vet and interview them. Long story short, I drove up to Colorado with my GF and my buddy. We were skiing and smoking weed. It finally came time for him to tell me his story. I green-texted it because it will come out much better that way. Foster joins in 62, volunteered for the draft, goes to Fort Gordon, Georgia, Military Police Academy, joins up with the 560th MP Company, gets stationed at the hood, volunteers to go to Vietnam because non-combatants are asking for people who want to do something interesting, and Foster says, sure. Flies in a 4-engine turboprop from Fort Hood to Oklahoma, Oklahoma to Oakland, California, Oakland to Hawaii, Hawaii to Wake Island, Wake Island to Guam, Guam to Malia, Malia to Saigon. Gets stationed at Tan Son Na Air Base. Jumping Joe Stilwell wanted helicopter gunners. They needed 16 guys from Foster's company. Foster, ever the volunteer, says, I'll do it. Foster's training consists of riding in the back of a pickup truck and shooting at targets with an M2 on the runway at the Tan Son Na Air Base. Base is pretty chill. Enlisted men and officers hang out with each other because at this point in time, Vietnam was the Wild West. There wasn't any ROEs. There really wasn't any conception of civilians being differentiated from the insurgents, be it Minh/Cong. Remember, this is before Kennedy got killed. Most Americans don't even know Vietnam exists. So the US forces did what they wanted. Foster iterated that. The VC didn't do much to US forces when he was there because the Vietnamese hadn't seen the US as a threat. Regardless, Viet Cong still threw grenades into the base, but Foster never had to haul ass into the bunker to avoid rocket fire. After training, which was cursory at best, Foster was a bona fide helicopter door gunner on the Servolsky H-19s and H-34s. Foster's crew ferried people all over the place, even up to the demilitarized zone, and more than likely into Laos and Cambodia. At this point in the story, when Foster started talking about missions, he began to get defensive about his service. I reassured him that I did not judge him negatively, and that I appreciated his service. Foster killed a lot of people, definitely killed women and children. He said, they were a guy with an SKS or AK, spraying the side of your bird. You fire. You lit up the whole block. The crew would do raids and close air support for guys on the ground. ERVN mostly. Foster would rain hellfire down on the entire country of Vietnam with impunity. Foster's officer friends were Sky Raider pilots. Some of the Sky Raiders had tandem seating. Foster said the Sky Raider pilots would fly up and down the Mekong and blow up sampans, little wooden boats, with their 6.50 cals. The boats didn't even need to shoot at them or have evidence of being supportive of insurgents. The pilots were told to just fuck shit up. Foster said the recoil from all 6 guns was enough to stall the Sky Raider. Back to door gunner. Foster got shot at with everything. Arrows, rocks, and of course bullets and RPGs. One day, Foster's tooth hurt. Goes into Saigon to see a French dentist. No American dentist at this point in time. Huge throng of locals blocking the street. Stop Foster and his jeep from continuing. In the middle of the street/intersection, Foster sees a Buddhist monk douse himself in gas and light himself on fire. Pretty much at this point, Foster literally has a heart attack. He shuffles back into his trailer and pops some nitro pills to help his heart. After getting everything settled, he smokes a cigarette and comes back inside. Sky Raider pilots had pet tigers on base. Foster continued doing helicopter runs until his tour ended. Goes back to the US to do stateside duty. Enlisted ends and Foster leaves the army. A few years after he left the military, some friendly gentlemen from Magnolia asked Foster to fight for them against commies in Africa. Foster declined and continued working as a fireman in Louisiana. I felt I should tell his story here, so you could all try to imagine Foster's experiences and remember his service. I'm sharing this story because I was forced to sit through it during New Year's Eve dinner, and I'm so freaked out and goddamn itchy that I need to get it out of my system. I'm sure some of you are going to breeze on by this little tantrum here and go right to the meat of the story because you're thinking, hey, I've got the stomach. Well, go for it. Boring stuff out of the way, he was drafted, and since he was short and skinny, he was the perfect tunnel rat. Those were the guys who wriggled all their way through the ridiculously narrow tunnels the Viet Cong used to transport personnel and weapons, set booby traps and all that. And when I say narrow, I mean narrow. Here's Pig. So Gramps was wriggling around a tunnel one day and a few bad things happened. First, the two other people with him got killed by a solitary Viet Cong while they were standing guard around the hole. Being a few feet underground and about 20 feet through meant Grandpa couldn't see who attacked them or know if anyone survived. He later learned he was the only one left to survive, but he assumed the Viet Cong attacker would start throwing grenades into the tunnel and he'd be done for. After a few minutes with no sign of an incoming attack, Grandpa breathed a sigh of relief and started moving forward again. A little while later though, it started pouring rain and the tunnel began to fill with water. Now, in an unfinished, unsupported tunnel like he was in, a rainstorm usually meant death for a tunnel rat. He'd heard horror stories from squad mates who'd lost others underground, never to be seen again. He figured he'd be another, but he wasn't gonna go out without a fight. He crawled forward. With him, he carried a small pistol and a Fulton flashlight. Originally, he'd been sent down to ambush some Viet Cong soldiers who were thought to be hidden in one of the tunnel's larger chambers. He'd crawl through, surprise them, blow their brains out, and wiggle his way back out. At least, that's how his first tunnel trip had gone. This one, his fourth, wasn't going so well. The tunnel narrowed as he crawled. Ahead of him, he heard rushing water. He thought it meant the main chamber was nearby. He was wrong. The sound was the muddy ground above him sloshing downward, sealing the tunnel ahead. This is where he started to panic. He knew he wasn't particularly deep in the ground, maybe 2.5 feet, but if he didn't start crawling upward through the ground really fast, he'd be a dead man. So he clawed. His fingernails tore off. His hands got cut up really bad, but he was able to get a part of his arm and face out of the mud. He was unable to move further. His lower back was pushed hard into the dirt, and the angle had him bent in an elongated U shape. His legs were trapped. Above him, a square foot of light shone through where he'd escape if he weren't stuck. He knew if it started to storm down again, he'd drown. But the rain didn't come. Insects did. Ants at first. Luckily, they weren't the big red ones everyone there was terrified. The ones with the bite that felt like you got shot. They were the tiny black ones, but there were lots of them. He assumed when the tunnel flooded, they were driven from their homes. Now they crawled over his scalp, face and neck. They didn't bite, but they tickled an itch. Those which found their way onto his lips were licked off and swallowed. He'd figure he'd be going a while without food. After a while, the ants lost interest. Flies became a problem though. To see why, you need to know the position in which he was stuck. The twisted, awkward angle of his body left one arm outstretched in front of him, but his shoulder and upper back were immobile, so he had a bit of movement in his upper arm, wrist, and hand. But anything below his elbow might as well have been paralyzed. Why is this relevant? Because the armpit was exposed. Not by much, maybe an inch of clearance, but there was more than enough for the flies, and they were very attracted to the warm, moist pit. Over the course of an hour, 20 to 30 brownish-black flies dove into his right armpit. They stayed for a little while, usually no more than 6 or 7 at a time, before they flew away. Of course, while inside, they bit. The pain was sharp and awful, he said. It reminded him of the deep, pinching itch of the horseflies on the bench near where he grew up, and he couldn't stop them from doing anything. He just ground his teeth. As the sun went down, the flies started to lose interest and flew away. He knew a few stayed and nestled because he felt them moving against the thick of his armpit. The majority had gone. Now just mosquitoes remained to torment him and their endless bites and bottomless gullets. Somehow he slept. From that moment the sun came up, new insects visited him. Of all the massive tropical bugs he'd seen in Vietnam, he was grateful to have so far avoided the giant centipedes he heard about. Massive, angry things as long as a man's forearm and as thick as a bottle of beer. One of his more sadistic squad mates hid one in the bunk of another poor bastard. It bit his feet and toes 10 times before he even jerked himself out of bed. Grandpa hated the tiny ones that he sometimes found in the basement back home, so the thought of those big ones made his blood run cold. This is what they looked like. God help you. 5 minutes after he opened his eyes to the morning light, One of them crawled onto his hand and wrapped itself around his wrist. He was too horrified to move. The little movement he had in his hand and wrist might have been enough to fling it away, but he didn't want to take a chance, so he waited. Apparently, this thing liked Grandpa, because it remained on him for well over an hour before Grandpa couldn't take the stress anymore. He tried to grab the bug in his fist. The moment he started moving, the thing began to bite. Grandpa was able to get a good grip on it and squeezed as hard as he could. The centipede broke in half in his hand and sent disgusting juices down his arm. The two pieces of its body dropped into the hole. The front part still had some life in it, and as it died, it bit Grandpa on the nose and lips, until he was forced to take its head in his teeth and kill it. He described the taste to us, but I'm not gonna write it out. Yeah, it was that awful. The rest of the day, he spent suffering, as flies swarmed around the carcasses of the centipede. They couldn't get enough of it. For long hours, he watched them eat and shit and fuck all over the monstrous bug. The juice on his arm too, which had dribbled all the way down into his armpit, was almost like the nectar of the gods for the flies. He could tell more were staying within the moist confines. The pinching and itching and tickling sensations were occasionally more torturous than the nastily swollen centipede bites. Ants too noticed the centipede corpse. This time, the little black ones weren't the only variant. The red monsters with the hideous jaws had arrived. Grandpa looked out though. They were more interested in killing the smaller ants than bothering him. He did say one of them bit the corner of his left eye, but the pain was much less than what the pussies at camp were always bitching about. Back in hell, it had started to rain. This was a mixed blessing for Grandpa. The majority of the bugs scurried away to find higher ground, but he was fairly certain the hole was going to fill with water, and he'd drown. Well, it didn't, and he didn't. He even got the chance to drink some rainwater. He'd been without any real food or water for well over 24 hours at that point, so he was grateful to swallow the few tablespoons worth he managed to get. There was a scary moment where the dirt below his lip shifted upwards, and he thought he was going to fall and get buried. Again, he looked out. The shift was minor. He'd been pinned in a strange, elongated U-shape for a while. Having a tiny bit of pressure relieved around his groin was definitely a plus. He was able to wiggle his hips and butt a little, and figured that there was maybe an inch or two of clearance in the area, but nothing that allowed him to get any hope of crawling out. He drifted to sleep at dusk and was awoken up before dawn by a severe pain in his armpit. He'd known all along that the flies were busy damaging his skin and probably eating it. He was resigned to that fact. As long as it wasn't another centipede, he wasn't going to complain. But this pain was new, and it was exquisite. The bites came much more frequently, and he felt a lot of them moving around. The pain, despite its severity, was dwarfed by what came next. Let me just make this known. I don't want to tell this part of the story. Just thinking about it makes me cringe, but goddammit, it's essential to his experience, and I'm sorry in advance for you having to read this. I'll try to make it quick. The shifting downward of the dirt was the result of an ant colony collapsing. A big one. All the ants came up out of the wreckage and had been hanging out on the surface of the dirt right below Grandpa's hips. As he started to settle to his new position overnight, the ants became agitated and swarmed him. And by him, I mean his crotch. Maybe the only thing that equaled the level of horror at the table, as he talked about the ants crawling into his penis and rectum, was how hard my grandmother laughed as he told it. "You've got to really see those scars," she exclaimed, as tears of laughter ran down her cheeks. My brother Derek's new girlfriend turned green and left the table, while Derek hurried after her. Grandma and Grandpa shared a kiss as he continued with the story. With the ants up his dick and asshole and flies building a housing project in his armpit, Grandpa suffered through the next 2 days in a haze of pain and fear. The lack of food and water had taken its toll on him. This, he told us, was somewhat helpful. The pain grew less acute as his consciousness waxed and waned. A tarantula wandered into the hole and Grandpa was able to bite its abdomen in half and suck out what was inside. This, of course, attracted more flies, but there was nothing he could do about it. If he didn't get some food and water in him, he'd die. His survival instinct was still intact despite all the trauma. A couple more days went by, and he blurrily realized he'd been stuck for about a week. The rainfalls and insect pulp had kept him hydrated, just enough to stay alive. His armpit was numb all the way down to the last rib on the right side. Flies were ignoring everything else and just going straight in and out of the pit. The adventurous ants had lost interest after a while, but every so often, he felt a nasty pinch on one incredibly sensitive area or another as more time passed. Late one afternoon, he heard gunfire. He heard quite a bit while he was stuck. but it was always off in the distance and too far for him to get any hope he'd be rescued. This time, though, it was very close. He was overwhelmed with a sense of hope, which was tainted by the concern that he'd been found on the wrong side. But to his astonishment, it wasn't the Viet Cong who heard him shouting after all the gunfire. Grandpa started waving his arm with a tiny bit of movement that he could muster. He heard someone yell, "Hey, there's an arm over here!" Grandpa yelled back incoherently and was soon greeted by the sight of a US soldier peering down on him. It took him and his squad mates 10 minutes to dig Grandpa out of the hole. He remembers all of them saying a variant of "holy fucking shit" after they freed him. Someone radioed their position, and after some unknown amount of time, a helicopter landed in a nearby clearing. Grandpa was loaded onto a stretcher and they lifted off. A medic who was along for the ride cut off Grandpa's shirt and promptly threw up. When the rest of the soldiers in the chopper looked at what the medic had seen, a few of them rained puke down the side of the aircraft. A few days after being rescued, Grandpa woke up in a hospital. Not one on the base either, one in the US. He had no idea how he got there. Once he was rescued, he passed out and slept for almost 36 hours. Some people thought he was in a coma until some poor medic tried to wake him up and Grandpa said, "Fuck off," and knocked the guy out with a single shot to the chin. Now awake, the doctors told Grandpa the extent of his injuries. Aside from the severe dehydration, he was absolutely riddled with infected bites. The ones on his more sensitive areas weren't much cause for alarm, despite their unpleasantness. It were the bigger bites that were much more of a concern. The one from the red ant was the worst, and for a while the doctors were worried he would lose his eye. His lips and nose had terrible swelling from the infected centipede bites. Even though all those bites were awful, he could have recovered in a few weeks, and would have been sent back to the tunnel soon after. But his armpit was why he was sent home. Botflies are the type of insect which lay their eggs inside flesh. Here's a picture of them in some poor bastard, and again, I'm sorry to do this to you. Until Grandpa's experience, no one knew they even had them in Vietnam, but apparently they do. The underside of his right arm, all the way down to nearly his hip, was completely reshaped into horrible cavities for their larvae. The doctors wouldn't operate, saying the only way to excise them was to let them gestate, and at a certain point, suffocate them with adhesive tape so they'd crawl to the surface. It took another few weeks, but that's what happened. Grandpa regaled us with the story of how he personally gave birth to 313 botfly larvae. Then he lifted up his shirt to show us the pockmarked skin. No one said much after that. He was done with the story, and after shoveling a slice of fruitcake into his mouth, he and Grandma left. They left all the way to the door. I don't really know what else to say, so yeah, that's Grandpa. Before my grandfather died, I convinced him to tell me a bunch of different stories about his time as an American soldier in Vietnam. Quite a few of them are paranormal / out of the ordinary, so I thought I should share them with X. If you have any knowledge about the Vietnamese paranormal stuff, please share, as I have a limited understanding of the subject. Also, wartime paranormal story thread, I guess. First, a little bit of context. Me, my grandfather, drafted, Centipede, infantryman, private. On top of this, my grandfather is really short, like 5'4" short. Gets assigned as a tunnel rat, disarm explosive and booby traps above ground, fight through and destroy Viet Cong tunnels below ground. Whoa, fuck me, may as well shoot me right now. Another guy in the platoon, half Hispanic, is short. Not as short as him, but still short. His name is Daniel, and is assigned as a tunnel rat with my grandfather. Together, they go on amazing subterranean adventures. Just kidding. Some of the shit they saw was, according to my grandfather, horrifying and mind-boggling. Story 1. Sent to clear out and destroy the tunnels, equipped with a shitty flashlight, bayonet, some explosives, and an old revolver, because the M1 911 was apparently shit for clearing out tunnels. Basic mission. They've done this a couple times before by now. Tunnels are pretty small, even for a rat tunnel. Not finding any traps or Viet Cong, the tunnel almost seemed abandoned. Whatever, they stay on guard for booby traps or armed Viet Cong lurking behind corners. Come to a larger section in the tunnels. They can stop crawling and go into a crouching / half-standing position. They can hear water running through the tunnel and start to think they are either above a river or that the tunnel just led to a watery cavern. Daniel shines flashlight over to the other side of the room, sees about 4 completely massive spiders. My grandfather says that they were longer than a foot, and each had a leg span of about 2 to 2.5 feet. 3 of them were bunched up right next to each other. One was resting about 3 feet away from the cluster. My grandfather hates spiders. He sits there paralyzed. Both of them sit there quietly, just staring at the spiders. This goes on for about 2 minutes. Grandfather takes his eyes off the cluster, looks towards the other one resting alone. It's not there. It's not there. My grandfather looks around and sees the spider on his left, slowly but steadily advancing towards him. He screams and fires at the thing, doesn't even seem to slow it down. He hauls ass back up the tunnel, with Daniel following close behind him. Daniel throws a grenade into the chamber as they're climbing back up through the tunnels. Make it out, screaming and yelling about spiders. Nothing follows them out. Must have died from the grenade, or it just stopped pursuing them. My grandfather told me the story, and he is pretty sure it wasn't even a Viet Cong tunnel they climbed into, but a tunnel the spiders themselves made. Story 2. This one's shorter. Once again, crawling underground to destroy a Viet Cong tunnel. Crouch walking through the tunnel, they find a not-so-hidden booby trap. It's one of those booby traps that would release a bunch of scorpions or snakes upon tripping it. Grandfather and Daniel stop to consider their options. Figure that they might be able to disarm the trap. How hard could it be? Pretty hard, apparently. This one was very complex for some reason. Not sure how to disarm the trap without releasing poisonous death animals. They decide just to blow the fucker up. Hope the tunnel doesn't collapse. America.png. Back up a good bit. Lob a grenade over in the general direction. Wait. Collateral damage. Trap is gone. Continue forward. As they get where the former trap was, they notice another tunnel, exposed by the grenade. Out of the new tunnel comes a 5-foot-long centipede, which barrels right past them, down deeper into the tunnels. Fuck this.jpg. Not wanting another incident like with the spiders, they plant their charges and haul ass out of the tunnel. They make it out of the tunnels, shaken, but no worse for wear. Pic related is the first thing Google gave me when I typed in Vietnamese centipede. Story 3. This one actually doesn't involve my grandfather directly, but in some of the stories that he heard from other guys while over there. At the beginning of the war, my grandfather was talking to a bunch of guys from different companies. They told him about how they saw a bunch of wild apes in the jungles. Bullshit, there's no apes in Vietnam. As the war goes on, more and more guys claim to see these apes. Oh fuck. They called them rock apes, as they threw rocks at the soldiers they encountered. Apparently, they were covered in red hair and were normally about 5 feet tall. Grandfather still isn't convinced. Thinks that the guys are either making shit up or are mistaken. A bunch of guys got really defensive. Say that they were woken in the middle of the night by screams and hollers while being pelted by rocks. When they went out to investigate, they were ambushed by the things. Apparently the apes were extremely strong and managed to kill 2 different soldiers. Still managed to fend them off. Grandfather still doesn't really believe the guy, which was odd because he saw a lot of weird shit too. Grandfather says they also heard stories about giant snakes in the jungle. Story 4. About halfway through the war, orders to clear out some tunnels. Start crawling through. Start faintly hearing voices, either Viet Cong or running water. Keep working their way through the tunnels. Voices get louder and louder. Oh fuck, this isn't water. Realize they're probably really close to a room full of Viet Cong. Decide to ambush them. They blow up the tunnels, pull out their revolvers and rush further down into the caves. Fall into a spacious room. Large white eyes all around them. Fuck, that's a lot of Viet Cong. Raising his flashlight, he notices that they are not Viet Cong. According to my grandfather, they were about 3 to 4 feet tall, lanky white, and had big eyes and ears. They were each wearing a bunch of different clothes, some obviously from looted corpses, others were basically just wearing rags. They made a hissing sound at him and Daniel, and started running deeper into the tunnels. Grandfather and Daniel were kind of awestruck, and didn't know what to do. Daniel keeps going on about Latin American folklore involving gnomes and shit. They eventually just climb out and report the tunnels as being abandoned. Story 5. This one doesn't actually involve tunnels. Grandfather and others resting. A few of the older soldiers go down to a nearby river to cool off. About 30 minutes later, one soldier comes back screaming about how something is in the river. Attacked one of them. Oh shit. They grab their rifles and first aid kit and run down to the river. 3 soldiers are on the bank of the river. One is bleeding profusely, and the other 2 are administering basic first aid. Grandfather says that something tore his leg completely off. They look in the river, which is now red from blood. They see a giant serpent eel-like creature swimming around, yellowish and long fins on its side. Said it looked like a massive moray eel with fins. What the fuck is this thing? They fire on it. It darts further down the river. They get the guy back to camp, but he dies of blood loss along the way. Story 6. Grandfather and Daniel are about to dive into some more tunnels. About to go in. when they hear a deafening roar come from the tunnel. Says it sounded like a fucking dragon. They're all stunned. Look at a nearby officer who just kinda shrugs and tells them to go in. Jeez, thanks asshole. This tunnel is apparently worse than most, filled with giant ants and spiders. Fucking spiders. Anyways, grandfather continues to crawl through. The roaring gets more frequent the further they crawl down. Fuck this, not gonna die today. They plant the charges right there and haul ass out of the tunnel. As they're crawling back up, the tunnel starts shaking like mad. They hurry the fuck up and get back up to the surface. Everything up there is shaking too. They detonate the charges, destroying most of the tunnel. Roaring and shaking proceeds to stop. Story 7. Last paranormal story I have. Even I have a hard time believing this one at times. But my grandfather was almost certainly sincere when he was telling it. He was crying and absolutely racked with grief. This one is a two-parter. Near the end of the war, once again, clearing out tunnels. No creepy crawlies thus far. Crawling through, they realize this tunnel leads into a cave of some sort. They explore the cave for a bit. They're about to head back up when they realize there's a light coming out from one of the passages in the cave, not either of their lights. Oh shit. They grasp their revolvers and walk through the passage. My grandfather says they walked into a well-lit room with brightly colored plant life that they couldn't recognize. The light was coming from an orb on the ceiling of the cave, vividly covered birds flying around everywhere. What the actual fuck is this place? Him and Daniel explore a little. Among other things, he finds spiky red fruit the size of a watermelon, and a bright yellow pool of water. Grandfather says it looked like he was in a fever dream. They head towards the back of the room, find a stone altar. Blood is stained across the stone, and there's a couple of knives and other tools lying about stone. Their curiosity turns into dread. They turn around and get the hell out. They stop. There are 5 reptilian-looking humanoids staring at them. Says they're about 5.5 feet tall, blackish green and scaly. They all appear to be wearing robes of some sort. Without hesitating, my grandfather and Daniel fire upon the creatures. One goes down, another shrieks out in pain. The room gets extraordinarily bright, and my grandfather passes out. Grandfather wakes up, back in the main part of the cave. The passage him and Daniel went down is gone. Daniel is also lying next to him, but is barely breathing. My grandfather could only do so much for him down there, and drags Daniel out of the cave, back up through the tunnels. He gets back out, and hauls up Daniel. They grab him, and send him off to get medical attention. After pulling Daniel out of the cave, grandfather remembers about what he saw in the cave. Says that his vision once again goes black, and he can't even remember the next 2 days. According to the other guys in his platoon, my grandfather was in a state of shock. He apparently could barely speak, and stuttered a lot, almost like he was shell-shocked or something. He was also sent to get medical attention. 2 days later, he mostly recovers. He goes back, asks the platoon about Daniel. Apparently, he died shortly after being pulled out of the tunnels. Grandfather breaks down. Apparently the war was close to ending after that. Only delved into 2 more tunnels after that experience. He legitimately hated anything subterranean after that. He despised caving, insects, and lizards, and even requested to be cremated so he wouldn't be buried underground. I showed him a picture of a generic reptilian alien, pic related, and he just about had a heart attack. He said that it just needed to be blacker, but that besides that it was pretty close. I don't have any more paranormal stories from my grandfather about the war. Feel free to share if you have any.